The candles had barely burned an hour when Elena Whitmore opened the door to her new bedroom and found a stranger sitting on her bed. The woman was beautiful in a sharp, deliberate way, wearing a green silk robe that clearly did not belong to a guest. She looked up at Elena with no shame at all, only a small, knowing smile, as if she had been expecting this exact moment for a long time. "You must be the bride," the woman said, standing slowly. "I'm Camille. I imagine Richard forgot to mention me." Elena's wedding gown was still buttoned to her throat. Her hair was still pinned the way her mother had arranged it that morning, when the whole house had smelled of roses, and everyone had told her how lucky she was. Now the roses were wilting in a vase by the window, and luck felt like a word from a different life. "Where is my husband?" Elena asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Downstairs, celebrating." Camille tilted her head. "He does love a good celebration." Elena did not move from the doorway. She had grown up being told that a duchess never raises her voice, never shows her hand, never lets the room see her flinch. She had watched her own mother live by that rule for 30 years, and she had promised herself she would never need it, because her marriage would be different. She had chosen Richard. She had loved him since she was 16 years old, since the summer he taught her to ride along the eastern fields, and laughed when she fell into the stream. She did not know, in that moment, whether to scream or to laugh at herself, forever believing in anything so simple as love. Footsteps came from the hallway, unhurried, almost lazy. Richard appeared in the doorway a moment later, his collar loosened, a glass of wine still in his hand. He looked at his bride, then at his mistress, and did not seem to find anything unusual about the arrangement at all. "Elena," he said, as if greeting her at breakfast, "you've met Camille." "I have not been introduced," Elena said. "I simply found her in my bed." Richard laughed, a short, careless sound that made something cold settle in Elena's chest. "Our bed," he corrected gently. "And Camille isn't going anywhere, my dear. She hasn't for 6 years. I only thought it kinder to let you find out on our wedding night than to have you hear it from the servants in a month." "Kinder," Elena repeated. "You'll adjust," he said. "Women of our class always do. My mother adjusted. Her mother before her adjusted. It is simply how a great house is run." Elena looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for some sign that this was a cruel joke, some flicker of guilt that would tell her the man she had married still existed somewhere beneath the wine and the arrogance. She found nothing. Only a man who believed, completely, that he had done nothing wrong. Camille walked past her toward the door, brushing close enough that Elena caught the scent of jasmine perfume, expensive and familiar, as though it had lived in this house longer than Elena had. "Don't worry," Camille said quietly, only for Elena to hear. "You'll get used to being second. I did, once, before I decided not to be." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Elena alone with the husband she had married that morning. "Come," Richard said, setting down his glass and reaching for her hand, as though nothing at all had happened. "It's our wedding night. Let's not spoil it with dramatics." Elena did not take his hand. She looked past him, out through the tall window toward the dark shape of the gardens, the fountain her father had once admired, the long gravel drive that led back toward the world she had left behind that morning, as a hopeful young woman. "I would like to be alone," she said. Something flickered across Richard's face then, not guilt, but irritation, the look of a man unused to being told no. "You are my wife," he said. "You do not get to be alone when I wish for company." "Then you should have thought of that before you brought another woman into our marriage, before it even began." For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire in the hearth cracked and settled. Somewhere below, faint music drifted up from the last of the wedding guests, laughter and clinking glasses, a party that had no idea the bride upstairs was standing in the wreckage of everything she had believed about her own life. Richard finally sighed. The sound of a man deciding an argument was not worth his evening. "Sulk if you like," he said. "By morning, you'll understand how things are done in this family. I am not the first Ashford man to keep a companion, and you will not be the first Ashford wife to look the other way." He turned and left without waiting for an answer, closing the door behind him with the careless ease of someone who had never once considered that a door could be closed against him instead. Elena stood very still in the center of the room that was supposed to be hers. She listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor, listened to the faint sound of Camille's voice greeting him somewhere near the stairs, low and familiar, the voice of a woman who had done this many times before. She did not cry. She had expected to cry. She had imagined, in the carriage ride from the church, that if anything ever went wrong in her marriage, she would weep the way the novels described, dramatic and broken. Instead, she found something else rising in her, quiet and cold and clear, like the first frost settling over a field at the end of autumn. She walked to the window and looked out at the estate that was now, by law and by marriage, half hers. The Ashford name had been carved into these walls for 4 generations. The land stretched further than she could see in the dark, fields and forests and tenant farms that paid rent into accounts she had never been shown. She had signed papers that morning, papers her father's lawyer had reviewed only briefly, papers that made her a duchess in name, and, she was beginning to realize, very little else. But papers, she thought, could be read more carefully. Papers could be understood. She sat down at the small writing desk near the window, the one that had belonged to Richard's late grandmother, according to the housekeeper who had shown her the room that afternoon with such pride. She found paper and ink already prepared for her, as if someone had expected the new Duchess might need to write letters home. She began, instead, to write down everything she could remember from the day, the names of the guests, the comments made in passing by Richard's mother, Lady Margaret, about old arrangements and family patience. The strange, knowing look the butler had given her when he showed her to this room, a room she now understood had likely hosted this exact scene before, with some woman before her. There was a soft knock at the door sometime near midnight. Elena expected Richard, returning with apologies he did not truly mean, or worse, without any apology at all. Instead, when she opened it, she found a young woman in a plain gray dress, holding a tray with tea and a small plate of bread, her eyes lowered respectfully. "I thought you might not have eaten, my lady," the woman said. "I'm Alice. I've been asked to attend to you." Elena studied her for a moment. There was something careful in the way Alice held herself, something that suggested she knew far more than she was saying. "Thank you, Alice," Elena said, stepping aside to let her in. "Please, come sit with me a moment, if you're permitted." Alice hesitated, glancing back down the hallway, as though checking for anyone who might report such a thing. Then she stepped inside, and closed the door quietly behind her. "You knew," Elena said, it was not a question, "about Camille, before tonight." Alice's hands twisted slightly in her apron. "Everyone in the house knows, my lady. She has rooms in the East Wing, has had them for years. The old Duke, his lordship's father, never approved, but he passed before he could put a stop to it. And by then, it was too late to matter to anyone, but the staff, who have to keep both households running smoothly, without speaking of it. And the last Duchess, Richard's mother, did she know as well?" "She knew from the start, my lady. She used to say a great house survives on silence more than on love." Alice looked down. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't speak so freely." "No," Elena said quietly. "Please. I would rather know the truth tonight than be surprised by it for the rest of my life." Alice studied her for a long moment, as if deciding something. Then she said, carefully, "There are ledgers, my lady, in the estate office. Household accounts, tenant rents, the Duke's personal expenses. I've seen the housekeeper carry papers there that don't add up to what we're told the house earns. I don't understand numbers well enough to say more than that. But I know money leaves this house that nobody speaks of." Elena felt something sharpen inside her, the way a hunter's attention sharpens at the first sign of a trail. "Thank you, Alice," she said. "I won't forget this." After Alice left, Elena did not sleep. She sat by the window until the sky began to lighten at its edges, turning over everything she now knew. She thought of her father, a practical man, who had built his fortune through careful attention to detail, rather than inherited titles. She thought of the lessons he had taught her without ever calling them lessons, teaching her to read a contract line by line, to notice when numbers in a ledger did not tell the same story twice. She had married into a family that assumed she would be decorative, quiet, grateful. They had not asked what her father had actually taught his only daughter. By the time the first gray light touched the gardens outside her window, Elena Whitmore, now Elena Ashford, Duchess in name if in nothing else yet, had made a decision. She would not scream. She would not weep in front of the household staff who were, she suspected, already placing quiet bets on how long she would last. She would not run home to her father and admit that her marriage had broken before it had properly begun. Instead, she would learn everything there was to know about this house, this family, and this husband, who believed a woman's only power was her patience. She had been patient once. She was done being patient now. Outside, a rooster called somewhere across the fields, and the estate began to stir with the business of a new day, unaware that the quiet young woman in the west bedroom had just declared a war that none of them would see coming until it was already lost. Morning arrived at Ashford Manor the same way it always did, with the smell of fresh bread from the kitchens and the sound of horses being led out to the eastern paddock. Nobody downstairs seemed to think anything unusual had happened the night before. To them, it was simply another day in a household that had long ago made peace with its own contradictions. Elena dressed herself before Alice arrived to help her, choosing a plain blue morning dress instead of anything that might suggest a woman still recovering from humiliation. She wanted to look composed. She wanted to look, more than anything, like someone who had already moved past what had happened, because she understood something about houses like this one. Weakness was noticed immediately, and it was rarely forgotten. She found Richard at breakfast, reading a newspaper as though the previous night had simply dissolved with the morning fog. He glanced up when she entered, gave her a brief nod, and returned to his paper. "Sleep well?" he asked, not looking up again. "Well enough," Elena said, taking her seat at the long table. "I understand Camille has apartments in the East Wing." Richard's eyes flicked toward her. A flash of surprise quickly smoothed over. "The staff talk too much." "The staff are loyal to whoever treats them with respect," Elena said calmly. "I intend to remember that." He set down his paper fully now, studying her with new interest, as if seeing something in her he hadn't expected. "You're taking this rather well. What would you prefer? Tears? Screaming?" Elena reached for the teapot and poured herself a cup with steady hands. "I was raised to understand that a marriage in our world is often a business arrangement wearing the clothes of romance. I simply did not expect the arrangement to include another woman quite so openly, quite so soon." "My father kept a mistress for 30 years, Richard said, as though this settled the matter entirely. "My grandfather kept 2, at different times. It is simply how men of our position manage their lives. My mother understood this. I expected you would, in time, understand it as well. And what would you say if I told you I intend to run this household exactly as thoroughly as your mother ran it before me? With full knowledge of every account, every arrangement, every promise made in this family's name?" Something in Richard's expression shifted, the faintest crack in his confidence, though he covered it quickly with a short laugh. "You needn't concern yourself with the accounts. That is a man's business." "It is a duchess's business," Elena corrected gently. "When the duchess's name is on the marriage contract that binds this estate's future to hers." Richard studied her for a long moment, then folded his newspaper with a decisive motion. "You surprise me, Elena. I confess, I expected quiet tears and a quick retreat to your father's house. I did not expect debate over breakfast." "I do not intend to retreat anywhere," Elena said. "I married you believing in something real. I intend to discover exactly what is real in this house, and what is simply convenient fiction." He rose from the table, tossing his napkin down with more force than necessary. "Do as you like. Explore the ledgers if it amuses you. You'll find nothing but the ordinary business of a large estate, and Elena," he added, pausing at the door, "Camille remains. That is not a discussion. That is simply a fact of this marriage, the same way the walls of this house are simply a fact of it. I would advise you to stop wasting your energy fighting things that cannot be changed, and instead, learn to enjoy everything else that comes with your new title." He left without waiting for a response, and Elena sat alone at the long table, the tea cooling in front of her, the morning light falling in long gold strips across the polished wood. She did not feel defeated. If anything, his warning told her more than he intended. A man who needed to insist so firmly that something could not be changed was often a man who feared, somewhere beneath his confidence, that it could. She spent the rest of the morning walking the house with Alice as her guide, learning its corridors and staircases, its unused rooms and locked doors, committing to memory the geography of a place she intended to understand completely before she decided what to do with it. She met the housekeeper, Mrs. Hughes, a stern woman with sharp eyes who answered every question with brief, careful politeness that told Elena exactly how much this woman had learned to guard over the years. She met the butler, Mr. Bennet, whose manner was formal, but whose gaze lingered on her with something like curiosity, as if he too were waiting to see what kind of duchess she would turn out to be. It was in the estate office, late in the afternoon, that Elena first encountered Mr. Edmund Clark, the family's longtime solicitor, a thin, gray-haired man who had clearly not expected to find the new Duchess sitting at the estate desk when he arrived to deliver quarterly documents. "Your Grace," he said, startled, straightening his coat. "I wasn't informed you would be reviewing the accounts." "I wasn't aware I required permission to review my own household's finances, Mr. Clark," Elena said pleasantly. "Please, sit. I have questions." He hesitated, glancing toward the door as though hoping Richard might appear to rescue him from this conversation. When no one came, he reluctantly took the offered chair. "These figures," Elena said, sliding a ledger across the desk toward him, "show quarterly payments to an account labeled only as CH Trust. Can you tell me what that represents?" Mr. Clark's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That would be a matter best discussed with His Grace directly. His Grace has already made clear he considers household finances beneath my concern," Elena said. "Fortunately, I disagree, and as I understand it, the marriage contract grants me equal standing in matters concerning the estate's assets, given that my father's dowry contribution was substantial enough to warrant such terms. Correct me if I am wrong, Mr. Clark, but I do recall my father's own solicitor insisting on that clause quite specifically before the wedding." The old man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something that might have been respect passing behind his careful composure. "You read your marriage contract closely, Your Grace." "I read everything closely," Elena said. "It is, I think, my one true talent. Now, about this trust." Mr. Clark was quiet for a long moment, weighing something in his mind that Elena could not quite read. Finally he said, "The trust in question was established some years ago, for the benefit of a woman named Camille Hart. It was set up using funds drawn against the estate's own accounts, structured in a way that, frankly, Your Grace, was never entirely proper, even by the standards this family has historically maintained." "Improper how?" "The trust was never formally registered with the estate's primary holdings. It exists, in essence, as a private arrangement between His Grace and the woman in question, funded through what should rightfully be considered joint estate income. Income that, as of your marriage yesterday, falls partly under your legal claim as well." Elena felt something settle into place inside her, quiet and precise, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding home. So the money paid to Camille Hart over these years was not simply the Duke's personal allowance to spend as he wished. It was estate income. Income that should have been shared, or at minimum accounted for honestly. That is one way to interpret the arrangement, Your Grace. A rather accurate way, I might add, though I would not have said so quite so plainly before today. "Why not?" Mr. Clark allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Because, Your Grace, no one has ever asked me quite so plainly before." Elena leaned back in her chair, looking out the tall office window at the gardens beyond, at the fountain her father had once admired during his visits, when the courtship between her and Richard had seemed like nothing but sunshine and promise. She thought of Camille's confident smile the night before, the easy certainty with which she had claimed her place in this house. She thought of Richard's careless assumption that his new wife would simply learn to look the other way, the same way his mother had, the same way generations of Ashford wives had before her. "Mr. Clark," she said slowly, "I would like copies of every document related to this trust, every payment, every date, every signature. I would also like to understand exactly what legal standing I now hold, as Duchess, over estate assets that were used improperly before my marriage began." "That is a significant request, Your Grace. It could take some time to compile." "Then I suggest we begin today," Elena said. "I find I have a great deal of time on my hands, now that my husband has made clear he does not require my company for anything beyond appearances." Mr. Clark studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from cautious formality into something closer to quiet respect. "Very well, Your Grace. I confess, I did not expect this house to see a woman quite like you." "Neither did I," Elena said softly, more to herself than to him. "But I find I am learning quickly." That evening, as the sun set behind the western fields, Elena stood once more at her bedroom window, watching the long shadows stretch across the lawns, where guests had celebrated her wedding only a day before. Somewhere in the East Wing, she knew, Camille was likely dressing for dinner, comfortable and secure in the arrangement she had maintained for 6 years. Somewhere downstairs, Richard was likely pouring himself another glass of wine, confident that his new wife would settle, in time, into quiet acceptance. Neither of them understood yet what kind of woman they had welcomed into this house. Elena intended to make sure they understood very soon. She thought of her father's voice, calm and steady, from years of lessons she had not realized, at the time, were preparing her for exactly this moment. "Never show your hand before you understand the whole game," he used to say, "and never mistake someone's cruelty for their strength. Cruel men are often the weakest, because they believe fear will do the work that respect should have earned them." Richard believed fear, or at least habit, would keep her quiet. He was about to learn how wrong he was. 3 days passed before Elena understood the true size of what she was uncovering, and each day the picture grew larger and darker than the one before it. Mr. Clark arrived each morning with new folders, new ledgers, new copies of documents pulled quietly from the estate archives before Richard could notice they were missing. He worked carefully, always glancing toward the door, always lowering his voice when speaking of certain names. Elena understood his caution. If Richard discovered what his solicitor was helping her uncover, there would be consequences, not only for her, but for Mr. Clark as well. Yet each morning he returned, and each morning Elena began to suspect that the old solicitor carried resentments of his own, buried deep beneath decades of quiet service to a family that had never once thanked him properly. "There's more," he told her on the third morning, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "I did not want to overwhelm you at once, Your Grace, but I think you are ready to see the full scope of it now." Elena opened the folder and found herself looking at a series of property deeds, each one bearing Richard's signature, each one transferring partial ownership of small parcels of land, cottages, and rental properties into Camille Hart's name over the past several years. "These are estate lands," Elena said slowly, turning the pages. "Ancestral lands, given away. Given, or in some cases, quietly sold at prices far below their true value," Mr. Clark confirmed. "His Grace has been dismantling pieces of the estate for years, Your Grace, always in small amounts, always structured to avoid drawing attention from the family's other holdings, or from outside inquiry. I suspect he believed no one would ever add the pieces together." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, not sorrow this time, but something sharper. "How much of the estate has been affected?" "By my calculations, perhaps 8% of the total holdings over the past 6 years. Enough to matter greatly to the estate's long-term value, but small enough, individually, that no single transaction would have raised alarm on its own. And my father's dowry, the money and land he contributed to this marriage. Where does that fit into all of this?" Mr. Clark hesitated. "Your father's contribution was substantial, Your Grace. It was intended, according to the marriage contract, to strengthen and stabilize the estate's finances for the next generation. Instead, I have reason to believe His Grace intends to use a significant portion of it to settle debts that have accumulated from exactly these kinds of arrangements." Elena sat back slowly, understanding now the full shape of what she had married into. Richard had not simply kept a mistress out of old family habit. He had been quietly bleeding the estate dry for years to support a second household, and now he intended to use her father's money meant to protect her future, and the future of any children she might have, to cover the damage he had already done. "Does his mother know the full extent of this?" Elena asked. "Lady Margaret knows more than she says, I suspect, though whether she knows the exact figures, I cannot say. She has always preferred not to look too closely at things that might disturb the peace of the household." Elena closed the folder carefully, her mind already moving several steps ahead. "Mr. Clark, I need to understand something clearly. If these transactions can be proven improper, if it can be shown that estate assets, including funds tied to my dowry, were misused without proper consent, what recourse would I have as Duchess?" Mr. Clark considered this for a long moment before answering. "The marriage contract your father's solicitor drafted was unusually thorough, Your Grace, likely because your father suspected, even before the wedding, that the Ashford family's finances were not as sound as their reputation suggested. It grants you significant standing to challenge any use of dowry funds that was not properly disclosed and agreed upon before the marriage. If it can be proven that His Grace concealed these debts and misused estate income to support an undisclosed arrangement, you would have grounds not only to protect your dowry from being used to cover his losses, but potentially to claim a controlling interest in significant portions of the estate itself, given the severity of the breach. Elena absorbed this slowly, feeling the shape of a plan begin to form somewhere in the back of her mind, still hazy, still incomplete, but undeniably present. And Camille Hart, what claim, if any, does she hold over these properties now that they bear her name? It depends on how the transfers were structured. Some appear to be outright gifts, difficult to reverse. Others were structured as loans or conditional transfers, meaning the properties could revert to the estate under certain circumstances, particularly if it can be shown that His Grace acted improperly in granting them. Then we need to know, precisely, which is which, Elena said. Every document, every clause. I want to understand this as thoroughly as I understand the rooms of this house. Mr. Clark studied her for a long moment, and something like admiration crossed his tired features. Your father chose his solicitor well when he drafted your marriage contract, Your Grace. But I confess, I believe he chose even better when he raised his daughter. Elena allowed herself the smallest smile, the first genuine one since her wedding night. My father always said the same lesson applied to both business and marriage. Never sign anything you have not read 3 times, and never trust anyone who tells you not to read the fine print. Later that afternoon, Elena crossed paths with Lady Margaret in the long gallery that connected the east and west wings of the manor, a corridor lined with portraits of Ashford ancestors, stretching back generations, each one staring down with the same faintly disapproving expression that seemed to run in the family's blood. You've been spending a great deal of time in the estate office, Lady Margaret observed, her tone light but her eyes sharp and assessing. Richard mentioned it with some concern. Did he? Elena said pleasantly. I would have thought he had more pressing concerns than my reading habits. Lady Margaret's mouth twitched, something between amusement and warning. You should be careful, my dear. Curiosity in a young wife is rarely rewarded in families like ours. My own mother-in-law taught me that lesson quite thoroughly, many years ago. And did you learn it well? Well enough to survive 40 years in this house, Lady Margaret said. Well enough to raise a son who believes, without question, that the world will always bend to his comfort, because it always has, for every man in this family before him. There was something in the older woman's voice that caught Elena's attention, a weariness beneath the composed exterior that suggested Lady Margaret's own peace with the family's arrangements might not run as deep as she pretended. You don't approve, Elena said carefully, of Camille, of any of it. Lady Margaret was quiet for a long moment, glancing up at one of the portraits, an older Ashford woman from perhaps 3 generations back, painted in cold blues and grays, her expression unreadable. I have spent my entire married life pretending not to see what everyone in this house has always seen clearly, she said finally. I did it because I believed, foolishly, that peace was worth more than pride. I am not certain, looking at you now, that I was right to believe that. What are you saying, Lady Margaret? The older woman met her eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. I am saying, my dear, that if you intend to fight for something in this house, you might find you have more allies than you expect, even among those who have spent decades pretending they had chosen silence willingly. She turned and walked away before Elena could respond, leaving her standing alone beneath the watchful, painted eyes of 4 generations of Ashford women who had all, in their own time, learned to survive a house built on secrets. That night, Elena wrote a long letter to her father, not asking for help, not admitting weakness, but requesting, in careful and deliberate language, copies of every document related to her dowry and the original marriage contract, along with the name of the solicitor who had drafted it. She sealed the letter and gave it to Alice to send by the earliest morning post, trusting the young maid's loyalty more with each passing day. Then she sat by her window once more, looking out at the dark shapes of the gardens, thinking of Camille's confident smile on the night of her wedding, of Richard's careless assumption that a quiet wife would always remain quiet, of Lady Margaret's tired confession in the gallery. She was no longer simply gathering information. She was building a case, piece by piece, the way her father had built his fortune, brick by careful brick, until the foundation beneath it was too solid for anyone to shake. Richard believed he had married a woman who would learn to accept her place. He had, instead, married the one person in his life who understood exactly how to take everything away from him, using nothing but the very documents he had signed with his own hand. A week into her marriage, Elena received a reply from her father, delivered by a private courier rather than the ordinary post, a sign of how seriously he had taken her letter. Along with the requested documents, he included a short note in his own careful handwriting. I trusted you to read every line of that contract before you signed it, and I see now that trust was well placed. Whatever you are building, my daughter, I stand behind you completely. Send word the moment you need my solicitor's presence, and he will be at Ashford Manor within 2 days. Elena read the note twice, feeling something warm settle in her chest, for the first time since her wedding night. She had married believing she was leaving her father's protection behind for her husband's. She was beginning to understand that a woman did not have to choose between the two, not if she was clever enough to use both. The documents her father sent confirmed everything Mr. Clark had already told her, and added crucial detail beyond it. Her father's solicitor had, indeed, drafted the marriage contract with unusual care, including a clause that Elena had somehow overlooked in her earlier reading, buried in dense legal language near the contract's end. It stated that any concealment of estate debts or improper use of dowry-linked assets, discovered within the first 2 years of marriage, would grant the Duchess the right to petition for a formal separation of assets, along with controlling interest over any properties tied to the concealed debts, without requiring her husband's consent. Elena sat with this knowledge for a long while, understanding now that her father had suspected something might be wrong with the Ashford family's finances even before the wedding, and had quietly built in protection for his daughter regardless of how confident everyone else seemed about the match. She brought the documents to Mr. Clark the following morning, watching his expression carefully as he read through the clause her father's solicitor had included. "This is remarkably thorough," he said finally, looking up at her with something like astonishment. "I confess, Your Grace, I did not review this particular clause closely when the contract was first signed. Marriage contracts of this length are rarely read in full, even by those of us paid to review them." "My father does not do anything by half measures," Elena said. "Now, Mr. Clark, I need your honest assessment. If I were to formally petition based on this clause, using the evidence we have already gathered, what would happen? To the estate, to Richard, to Camille and the properties transferred to her." Mr. Clark set down the document slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. "If your petition succeeds, Your Grace, and I believe, given the strength of this evidence, that it would, the properties transferred to Miss Hart, under improper circumstances, would revert to estate control, meaning to your control, given your position as the wronged party in this arrangement. His Grace would retain his title, as that cannot be legally separated from him, but the practical management of the estate's assets, its income, its properties, its financial decisions, would transfer substantially into your hands, until such time as the debts and improprieties are fully resolved, if ever. And if Richard refuses to cooperate, if he fights the petition, he would need to prove the transfers were proper and disclosed, which the evidence we hold makes extremely difficult. More practically, Your Grace, a public legal battle of this nature would destroy what remains of this family's reputation in society. I suspect His Grace understands that risk quite well, even if his pride prevents him from admitting it aloud." Elena nodded slowly, the plan finally taking full shape in her mind. She did not want simply to punish Richard, though there was a part of her, small and human, that wanted exactly that. She wanted something more lasting. She wanted control, real control, over the life she had been promised on her wedding day, and denied within hours of the ceremony ending. "I want to give him one chance first," she said finally. "Not out of kindness, Mr. Clark, but out of strategy. If I move directly to a legal petition, he will fight, out of pride if nothing else. And the battle will be long and public and costly for everyone involved, including the tenants and staff who depend on this estate's stability. But if I present him with the evidence privately first, and make clear what I am prepared to do if he does not cooperate, I suspect his pride will find a quieter surrender far more appealing than a public defeat." Mr. Clark studied her with open respect now. "That is a wise approach, Your Grace, though I would caution you to have every document ready and every argument prepared before that conversation happens. Men like His Grace rarely surrender easily, even when the evidence against them is overwhelming." "I intend to be ready," Elena said. "Which is why I will need one more thing from you, Mr. Clark. I want a complete summary, in plain and simple language, of everything we have found, organized in a way that leaves no room for argument or confusion." I want Richard to look at these papers and understand, immediately and completely, that there is no version of events in which he wins this conversation. Mr. Clark began preparing the summary that same afternoon, and Elena spent the following days reviewing every page with careful attention, memorizing dates and figures until she could recite them without glancing at her notes. She practiced, in the quiet of her room, exactly how she would present each point, anticipating every argument Richard might raise, and preparing her response before he could even voice it. Meanwhile, life in the manor continued its strange, uneasy rhythm. Richard spent his evenings with Camille, making little effort to hide the arrangement now that Elena had already discovered it, though he seemed, Elena noticed, slightly less confident in his casual dismissals of her whenever their paths crossed at meals. Perhaps he sensed something shifting in the household, some change in the air that his pride refused to let him examine too closely. Lady Margaret, too, seemed to watch Elena with growing interest, offering small comments over dinner that Elena began to understand as quiet encouragement disguised as idle conversation. "You seem well occupied these days, my dear," she said one evening. "I do hope whatever project has captured your attention proves worth the effort." "I believe it will, Lady Margaret," Elena replied, meeting the older woman's eyes with quiet confidence. "I believe it will prove worth a great deal, in fact." Even Camille seemed to notice the change, though she attempted to hide it behind her usual confident smile. Elena encountered her once in the long gallery, both women pausing beneath the same row of ancestral portraits that had witnessed generations of the family's secrets. "You've been busy," Camille said, studying Elena with narrowed, calculating eyes. "Richard mentions it, though he pretends not to notice." "I've simply been learning my new home," Elena said pleasantly. "There is a great deal to learn, it turns out, in a house with so many hidden corners." Camille's smile faltered slightly, just for a moment, before she recovered her composure. "Whatever you think you've found, Elena, I would advise caution. Richard does not respond well to challenges to his authority. I've seen it before, with others who tried." "Others?" Elena asked, genuinely curious now. "There were others who tried to challenge this arrangement?" Something flickered across Camille's face, quickly hidden, but Elena had caught it. The faintest shadow of uncertainty, in a woman who had clearly built her entire life around the confidence that her position in this house was unshakable. "Never mind," Camille said, turning to leave. "I only meant to offer a friendly warning." "How kind," Elena said softly to the empty gallery after Camille's footsteps had faded away. "Though I find I no longer require warnings from anyone in this house. I require only patience, and I have more of that than anyone here realizes." That night, as Elena reviewed her final notes by candlelight, preparing for the conversation she intended to have with Richard within the week, she felt none of the fear or uncertainty that had gripped her on her wedding night. Instead, she felt something closer to calm, the particular calm of someone who had stopped hoping for rescue and started building one for herself. She thought of her father's letter, of Lady Margaret's quiet encouragement, of Mr. Clark's growing respect, of Alice's steady loyalty. She had arrived at this house alone and humiliated, believing herself powerless against a husband who held every advantage. She understood now that power in a house like this one had never truly belonged to whoever held the title. It belonged to whoever understood the house completely. Every ledger, every secret, every quiet alliance waiting to be recognized and gathered together. Richard held the title of Duke. Elena was quietly building something far more valuable. She was building the truth, organized and undeniable, and she intended to use it exactly the way her father had taught her to use every tool in business and in life. Carefully, patiently, and without ever showing her hand until the moment it would matter most. Elena chose a quiet Tuesday evening for the conversation, after the household staff had cleared away dinner and retired for the night, when the manor settled into the particular stillness that made every sound carry further than it should. She had asked Richard to meet her in the estate office rather than the drawing room, a small but deliberate choice, since the office had always been considered his domain, and she wanted him to understand, from the very first moment, that this ground now belonged to her as well. He arrived late, as she had expected, still smelling faintly of wine, though not drunk enough to slow his sharp tongue.
"You wish to speak with me," he said, settling into the chair across from the desk with the casual air of a man doing her a favor by attending at all.
"Mother mentioned you've been quite occupied lately. I do hope you haven't been troubling poor Clark with too many questions about household trivialities." I have been troubling Mr. Clark a great deal, actually, Elena said, sliding the prepared folder across the desk toward him, though I would not call what we discussed trivial. Richard opened the folder with visible impatience, expecting, Elena suspected, some minor complaint about household budgets or staff wages. His expression shifted quickly as he began reading, the impatience draining away into something colder and more focused. "Where did you get these?" he said quietly, without looking up. "They were never hidden as carefully as you believed," Elena said. "Property deeds, trust documents, 6 years of payments drawn from estate income and funneled into accounts benefiting Camille Hart, structured specifically to avoid appearing on the primary estate ledgers where anyone might notice the pattern." Richard's jaw tightened. "This is not your concern. It became my concern the moment I signed a marriage contract that ties my father's dowry to the financial health of this estate," Elena said, her voice remaining calm and level, exactly as she had practiced. "A contract, Richard, that includes a clause specifically protecting me should I discover concealed debts or improper use of estate assets within the first 2 years of our marriage. A clause your own family's solicitor apparently did not read as closely as my father's did." She watched him closely as understanding began to dawn, watched the confidence that had defined every interaction between them since her arrival begin, for the first time, to crack. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "No court would side with a bride of 1 week over the established head of an ancient family." "I am not planning to go to any court, Richard, not yet at least. I am simply informing you of what I have found, and what I am legally entitled to do with that information, should you continue treating me as though my presence in this house is nothing more than decoration." Elena leaned forward slightly. "You have 2 choices before you tonight. You can continue believing that nothing here needs to change, that I will eventually grow tired and accept the arrangement the way your mother accepted yours before you. Or you can recognize that the woman you married is not interested in quiet acceptance, and that I am prepared to use every legal advantage available to me to protect what my father built, and what I am now, by law, entitled to protect." Richard stood abruptly, pacing toward the window, his hands clenched at his sides. "You would destroy this family's reputation over a mistress who existed long before you ever entered this house. I would protect my own future, and any children we might have, from a husband who has spent years quietly draining the estate to fund a second household, using money that was never entirely his to spend so freely," Elena said. "I am not the one destroying anything, Richard. You did that yourself, years before I arrived, one small transaction at a time, believing no one would ever add the pieces together." He turned back to face her, and for a moment Elena saw something she had not expected, a flash of genuine fear beneath the anger, the look of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life, that the world might not simply bend to accommodate his comfort. "What exactly do you want?" he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I want the properties transferred to Camille Hart reviewed, and, where legally possible, returned to estate control. I want full transparency in the household accounts going forward, with equal access granted to me as Duchess. And I want my father's dowry protected entirely, untouched by any debts accumulated through arrangements I was never consulted about." Elena paused, watching him carefully. "I am not asking you to end your relationship with Camille, Richard, though I suspect that is what you fear most hearing right now. I am asking only that it no longer come at the expense of this estate's future, or mine." Richard was silent for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across the desk between them, evidence of years of careless decisions now laid bare in unforgiving detail. "And if I refuse," he said finally, though the fight in his voice had noticeably weakened, "then I will petition for a formal separation of assets, using the evidence Mr. Clark has already helped me compile, along with my father's full legal support." The proceedings would become public, Richard. Every transaction, every improper transfer, every year of concealment would become a matter of record for society to discuss over their own dinner tables. I suspect your mother, at least, would not survive that particular humiliation with much grace." The mention of his mother seemed to land harder than anything else Elena had said, and she watched him deflate slightly, the last of his bravado draining away into something closer to weary resignation. "You've thought of everything," he said quietly. "I had a great deal of time to think, Richard, on the night you left me alone in our bedroom to entertain your mistress downstairs," Elena said, and for the first time since the conversation began, a trace of the anger she had carefully controlled for days slipped into her voice. "I do not intend to be a fool twice." Richard sank back into his chair, the folder still open before him, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Elena waited, patient as she had learned to be over the past week, understanding that this silence belonged to him now, that whatever decision emerged from it would shape everything that followed. "I will need time to consider this properly," he said finally. "You have until the end of the week," Elena said. "After that, I will proceed with the petition regardless of your answer, because I no longer intend to wait for your convenience to protect what is rightfully mine." She rose from the desk, gathering the remaining documents into her folder with steady hands, and walked toward the door without waiting for his response. Just before she left, she paused, looking back at the man she had married, believing him to be someone entirely different from who he had shown himself to be. "For what it's worth, Richard," she said quietly, "I did not want this. I wanted the marriage I believed we were building, before your wedding night gift showed me exactly what kind of husband you intended to be. This is not revenge. This is simply the consequence of choices you made, long before I understood what they would cost me." She closed the door softly behind her, leaving him alone in the office with the evidence of 6 years of careless decisions spread across the desk, and walked back to her room, through the quiet, dark corridors of a house that, for the first time since her arrival, felt as though it might one day truly belong to her. The week that followed, the confrontation in the estate office moved slower than any week Elena had ever lived through, each day stretched thin by uncertainty and quiet anticipation. Richard avoided her at meals, taking his breakfast early and his dinner late, and when their paths did cross in the corridors, he offered only brief, guarded nods before disappearing into whatever business occupied his time now. Elena did not chase him for an answer. She had learned enough about her husband in these short weeks of marriage to understand that pressure applied too quickly often produced only stubborn resistance, while patience, properly deployed, could accomplish far more. Instead, she used the week to strengthen her position further, meeting quietly with Mr. Clark each morning to review additional details of the estate's finances, and spending long afternoons with Lady Margaret, whose initial guarded comments in the gallery had slowly grown into something resembling genuine confidence between the two women. "You've changed something in this house already," Lady Margaret observed one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens Elena's father had once admired. "I can feel it, even if I cannot quite name what it is. I've simply stopped pretending I don't see what everyone else has spent years pretending not to see," Elena said. "You told me yourself, Lady Margaret, that this house survives on silence. I find I have very little patience left for silence." Lady Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying the roses that lined the garden path, their final autumn blooms clinging stubbornly to branches that would soon need pruning for the winter ahead. "My husband kept a mistress for the last 15 years of his life," she said finally, her voice carrying none of its usual careful composure. "I knew of it from nearly the beginning. I said nothing, because I believed, as I was taught to believe, that a duchess's dignity depended on her silence rather than her voice. I have wondered, many times since his passing, whether I would have been happier, or at least more myself, had I chosen differently." "It is not too late to choose differently now, Lady Margaret," Elena said gently, "even in small ways." The older woman looked at her with something like gratitude, an expression Elena had not expected to see on that proud, guarded face. "I believe, my dear, that I would like to help you, if you'll allow it. I know things about this family's history, about arrangements made and broken over the years, that even Mr. Clark may not fully understand. I think it is time someone in this family finally used that knowledge for something other than maintaining a peace that was never truly peaceful at all." Over the following days, Lady Margaret proved an unexpectedly valuable ally, providing Elena with details about older family arrangements that predated even Camille's involvement, patterns of behavior that stretched back generations, and confirmed what Elena had already begun to suspect: that the Ashford family's tradition of concealment ran far deeper than one man's carelessness, woven into the very structure of how the estate had been managed for decades. Meanwhile, word of the tension in the household had begun, inevitably, to spread beyond the manor's walls. Elena learned from Alice that whispers had reached the village, carried by servants who moved between households and shared gossip over market stalls and church gatherings. The story, in its early form, suggested only that the new Duchess had proven unexpectedly sharp-tongued and difficult, hardly the scandal Richard would have feared most. But Elena understood that stories, once released into a community as tightly connected as this one, rarely stayed contained for long, and she suspected Richard understood this as well, which likely explained the growing tension she noticed in him as the deadline she had set drew closer. On the 5th day, Camille approached Elena directly, for the first time since their conversation in the gallery, finding her in the small library where Elena had taken to spending her afternoons reviewing documents, away from the household's watchful eyes. "You've put him in an impossible position," Camille said without preamble, closing the library door behind her. "Whatever you think you're accomplishing, Elena, you should know that Richard is not a man who responds well to being cornered." "I'm not interested in cornering him, Camille. I'm interested in protecting what is legally mine, and correcting arrangements that were never properly disclosed to me before I signed a marriage contract binding my future to this family's fortunes." Elena set down her pen and studied the other woman carefully. "I confess, I am curious about something. You mentioned once that there were others who challenged this arrangement before. What happened to them?" Camille's confident expression flickered, just slightly, before she recovered it. "That is not relevant to this conversation." "I think it is entirely relevant," Elena said. "If I am to understand the full pattern of how this family handles inconvenient truths, I would like to know exactly what happened to the people who tried to speak them aloud before me." For a long moment, Camille said nothing, and Elena watched something shift behind her carefully maintained composure. A crack that suggested the confident mask she wore had cost her more effort than she liked to admit. "There was a woman, years ago, before Richard's father passed," Camille said finally, her voice quieter than Elena had ever heard it. "A cousin of the family, distantly connected, who discovered similar arrangements and threatened to expose them publicly. She was quietly discouraged from pursuing the matter further, through means I was never told the full details of, though I understood enough to know the family took the threat seriously and dealt with it thoroughly." She paused. "I tell you this not to frighten you, Elena, but because I think you should understand exactly what kind of family you have married into, and exactly how far they might go to protect their reputation. And yet you remain here, benefiting from that same protection," Elena said quietly. "Are you not concerned about what might happen to you, should this family decide your continued presence has become inconvenient rather than useful?" Something flickered in Camille's eyes then, a flash of genuine uncertainty that told Elena she had struck closer to a hidden fear than she had expected. "I have made my choices, and I live with them," Camille said finally. "But I will say this. If Richard decides the cost of keeping me has grown too high, given everything you have uncovered, I do not believe his loyalty will extend far enough to protect me from whatever consequences follow. Men like Richard protect themselves first, always. I learned that lesson a long time ago, and I suspect, Elena, you are beginning to learn it as well." She left without waiting for a response, and Elena sat alone in the quiet library for a long while afterward, turning over this new information carefully. She had assumed, until this conversation, that Camille represented a unified front alongside Richard, but she understood now that the arrangement between them was far more fragile than either had allowed the household to see. Camille's confidence, it seemed, was built on far less certain ground than her manner suggested. That evening, as the deadline Elena had given approached its final hours, a message arrived from Richard, delivered by Mr. Bennet with unusual formality. He requested her presence in the estate office once more, after dinner, to discuss his decision. Elena dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a deep green gown that made her feel, if not entirely confident, at least composed and prepared for whatever answer awaited her. She thought of her father's letter, of Lady Margaret's quiet confession in the garden, of Camille's unexpected warning in the library, and understood that whatever happened in the estate office tonight would determine not only her own future in this house, but the shape of everything that came after. She walked down the familiar corridors toward the office with steady steps, ready, at last, to hear what Richard had decided. Richard was already seated behind the desk when Elena entered the office, a decanter of wine untouched beside him, which surprised her more than anything else about his appearance that evening. His face looked tired in a way she had not seen before, the careless confidence of their first meetings, replaced by something heavier, something closer to genuine exhaustion. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. Elena did, watching him carefully, waiting for whatever he had decided. "I have spoken with Mr. Clark privately," Richard began, his voice measured in a way that suggested careful rehearsal. "He confirmed everything you presented to me, and confirmed, as well, the strength of the legal position you hold, thanks to your father's foresight in drafting our marriage contract." He paused, staring down at his hands rather than meeting her eyes. "I have decided not to fight your petition, Elena. I will agree to the terms you outlined. The properties transferred to Camille will be reviewed, and where legally possible, returned to estate control. The household accounts will be opened fully to you, going forward, with equal access and equal say in major financial decisions. Your father's dowry will remain untouched by any existing debts." Elena had prepared herself for resistance, for arguments, for some final attempt at manipulation or delay. She had not fully prepared herself for this quiet, weary surrender, and for a moment she simply sat in silence, absorbing the shift in the balance of power that his words represented. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why agree now, when you fought so hard against even acknowledging the problem a week ago?" Richard was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I spoke with my mother this week, properly, for the first time in years. She told me things about her own marriage I had never fully understood, about the cost silence extracted from her over 4 decades. A cost she paid so quietly that I mistook her peace for genuine contentment, rather than the exhaustion it truly was." He finally looked up, meeting Elena's eyes directly. "I do not want that for you, Elena. Whatever else you may think of me after everything that has happened, I was raised to believe certain things about how a great house is run, about what a wife should accept, and a husband should be permitted. I am beginning to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that those beliefs were built on a foundation that required someone's silent suffering to remain standing. I am not entirely ready to become a different man overnight, but I am ready, at least, to stop asking you to be the one who suffers silently for my comfort." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the manipulation she half expected to find beneath his words, but found instead something that looked, remarkably, like genuine reflection. She did not fully trust it yet, not after everything that had happened in the short weeks of their marriage, but she recognized it as a beginning, however uncertain. "And Camille," she said finally, "what happens to her, in all of this?" Richard's expression grew more complicated at the mention of her name. "I will provide for her separately, from my own personal allowance rather than estate income, going forward. The properties already transferred that can be legally reversed, will be. Those that cannot, she will keep, as agreed compensation for years of arrangement I should never have structured the way I did. But she will no longer have any claim on estate resources beyond what I choose to provide from my own means." He paused. "She will likely leave the manor soon, I suspect. I do not believe our arrangement can continue as it has, not with everything that has changed between us these past weeks." Elena nodded slowly, understanding that this resolution, imperfect as it was, represented the most honest outcome available, given everything that had come before. She did not feel triumphant, exactly, though she recognized the significance of what she had accomplished. She felt, instead, a quiet sense of ground finally settling beneath her feet, solid enough at last to build something upon. "I will need everything in writing," she said, "reviewed by Mr. Clark, and by my father's solicitor as well, before I consider this matter resolved." "Of course," Richard said. "I would expect nothing less from you, at this point." There was something almost like respect in his voice as he said it, and Elena recognized, with some surprise, that whatever else had broken between them on their wedding night, something new was beginning to form in its place. Not the romantic partnership she had once imagined, but perhaps something more durable, a partnership built on clear terms and mutual understanding, rather than assumption and silence. Over the following weeks, the agreement was formalized exactly as Richard had promised. Mr. Clark drafted the documents with careful precision, and Elena's father's solicitor traveled to Ashford Manor personally to review every clause before allowing Elena to sign. The properties that could legally be reversed were returned to estate control, restoring nearly 6% of the holdings that had been quietly stripped away over the previous years. The household accounts were opened fully to Elena's inspection, and she began, gradually, to take on genuine responsibility for the estate's financial management, a role she discovered she possessed a genuine talent for, sharpened by years of her father's careful lessons. Camille departed Ashford Manor on a gray morning in late autumn, her belongings loaded into a carriage that Elena watched from her bedroom window without any particular satisfaction, only a quiet sense of closure. She caught Camille's eye briefly as the other woman climbed into the carriage, and Camille offered a small, unreadable nod, something between acknowledgement and grudging respect, before the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive and disappeared from view. Lady Margaret, in the months that followed, became an unexpected friend and ally, her guarded formality slowly softening into genuine warmth as she and Elena worked together to address other long-buried irregularities in the estate's history, uncovering and correcting arrangements that had gone unquestioned for generations. Richard and Elena's marriage did not transform overnight into the romantic partnership Elena had once dreamed of on her wedding day. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, could not be rebuilt through a single conversation or a single set of legal agreements. But something honest began to grow between them in the months that followed, built on the foundation Elena had constructed so carefully, document by document, conversation by conversation, until the woman who had once stood humiliated in her own bedroom on her wedding night had become, unmistakably, the person truly running Ashford Manor. By the time winter arrived, dusting the gardens with the first frost of the season, Elena stood once more at her bedroom window, looking out over land that was now, in every meaningful sense, hers to protect and shape. She thought back to that first terrible night, to Camille's confident smile, and Richard's careless dismissal, to the moment she had decided, quietly and completely, that she would never again allow herself to be treated as decoration in her own life. She had arrived at this house as a bride humiliated within hours of her wedding. She remained now as its Duchess in every sense that mattered, not because a title had been given to her, but because she had earned every measure of respect and authority she now held. Through patience, through careful attention, and through a willingness to fight for what was rightfully hers, when everyone around her had expected her simply to accept less. The sun rose over the eastern fields the next morning exactly as it always had, gilding the frost-covered gardens in pale gold light, and Elena Ashford watched it from her window, no longer a frightened bride wondering what her marriage had become, but a duchess who understood, completely and without doubt, exactly what she had built for herself, one careful decision at a time. Spring returned to Ashford Manor the following year, and with it came a season of change that none of the household staff could have predicted on the night Elena first arrived as a humiliated bride. The gardens bloomed fuller than they had in years, tended now under Elena's careful direction, since she had discovered, quite by accident, that she possessed a genuine love for cultivating things that others had long neglected. The estate itself had grown stronger under her steady management. The properties recovered from the improper transfers had been restored to productive use, generating income that flowed back into the tenant farms and local village, rather than disappearing into arrangements no one had ever properly understood. Tenants who had once paid rent into accounts managed by careless overseers now found their concerns addressed directly, often by Elena herself, who insisted on walking the estate's boundaries personally each season to understand exactly what her people needed. Mr. Clark remained a trusted advisor, his loyalty to Elena only deepening with each passing month as he watched her transform theoretical knowledge into practical wisdom, correcting decades of quiet mismanagement with a precision that impressed even the most skeptical members of the local gentry. Lady Margaret, too, had found new purpose in her later years, working alongside Elena to establish a small charitable trust supporting widows and children in the surrounding villages, a project that gave the older woman a sense of meaning she confessed she had not felt since her own youth. Richard changed more slowly than either of them, but change he did, in small and meaningful ways that Elena noticed even when he seemed unaware of them himself. He began attending estate meetings alongside her, listening rather than dismissing, occasionally offering genuine insight, born from years of quiet observation he had never before bothered to voice aloud. He apologized, once, properly, for the wedding night that had begun their marriage in such cruelty, an apology Elena accepted, not because it erased what had happened, but because she recognized the courage it required for a man raised to believe himself entitled to everything, to admit instead that he had been deeply wrong. News reached the manor occasionally of Camille, who had settled in a smaller property some distance from Ashford lands, living quietly on the allowance Richard continued to provide from his personal funds rather than estate income. Elena felt no particular animosity toward her former rival when these updates arrived, only a distant sort of understanding, recognizing that Camille too had been shaped by a family system that offered women very few honest paths to security and respect. The cousin Camille had once mentioned, the woman who had tried and failed to expose the family's arrangements years earlier, resurfaced during this period as well, encouraged by whispers of the changes happening at Ashford Manor, to finally share her own story, after years of enforced silence. Elena welcomed her correspondence warmly, and together with Mr. Clark's careful legal guidance, they were able to quietly correct some of the old injustices that had been done to her, restoring a measure of dignity and financial security that the family had denied her for far too long. By the time autumn returned once more, Elena stood in the same gardens where she had once walked with Lady Margaret, discussing the weight of decades of silence, though now, the roses bloomed fuller, and the estate hummed with a quiet, honest energy that had been entirely absent when she first arrived. She thought often of that first terrible night, not with the raw pain it had once carried, but with a kind of distant clarity, understanding it now as the moment she had discovered exactly what she was capable of, when everything she believed about her future collapsed in an instant. She had not simply survived her wedding night. She had transformed it into the beginning of everything that followed, a lesson she carried forward into every decision she made as Duchess. That true strength rarely announced itself with anger or drama, but instead built itself quietly, patiently, one careful and deliberate choice at a time, until the woman who had once stood humiliated in her own bedroom became the very foundation upon which an entire estate, and everyone who depended upon it, could finally stand secure. The sun set that evening behind the western fields exactly as it always had, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and Elena Ashford watched it from the same window where she had once stood in disbelief and heartbreak, now filled instead with a quiet, hard-earned sense of peace. She had arrived at Ashford Manor believing her story would be written entirely by the man she married. She had learned, instead, to write it herself.